The empty soup pot, the hardest kind of generosity, is giving away the last thing you have. Gloria Brooks stood alone in the small community kitchen and stared at the large metal soup pot resting on the stove. Steam rose slowly into the air, carrying the scent of chicken and herbs through the quiet room. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. The weather report had called it the coldest night of the year, and for once the weather report was right. Most people in the neighborhood were already inside, wrapped in blankets, protected from the wind. Gloria glanced toward the nearly empty pantry. A few cans, a bag of rice in the corner. Beyond that, very little. The soup simmering in front of her represented almost everything she had left. At 72, Gloria lived on a modest fixed income and had learned long ago how to stretch a dollar until it begged for mercy. Nothing was wasted. Every grocery trip required a plan. Yet tonight she faced a choice, and she had already made it. Through the front windows, she could see them gathering beneath the streetlights, emerging one by one from the rain. Men in old jackets, with worn backpacks, with faces that showed the weight of difficult years. Veterans. Some had served decades earlier. Some had nowhere to sleep. Some had not eaten a proper meal in days. She counted quietly as they came in. 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. She knew many of them by name. Others were new. To her it made no difference. Hunger looked the same on everyone. She picked up her wooden spoon and began filling bowls. Each one she filled lowered the level inside the pot, brought her closer to the bottom. Yet she never once hesitated. Near the back of the room sat a quiet man with silver hair and tired eyes. Unlike the others, he spoke very little. He watched her the way a person watches something he has been searching for. When she reached his table, she set a bowl and a piece of bread in front of him. "Eat while it's hot," she said. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "Thank you, ma'am." There was something unusual in the way he said it. Something careful. Something that did not match the worn jacket. Gloria smiled and moved on. She never noticed the way he kept watching her afterward. She never noticed him studying the nearly empty pantry, the nearly empty pot. And she certainly never imagined that one decision, made in that rain-soaked room, would set in motion something an entire neighborhood would talk about for years. She believed she was feeding 30 hungry men. She had no idea she was being identified. The warmth inside the center slowly pushed back the cold that had followed the men through the door. Gloria moved between the tables, refilling cups, asking quietly whether anyone wanted a second helping. She never rushed. She never made a single one of them feel like a burden. Few people in town knew the sacrifices hidden behind her kindness. She lived alone in a small house at the edge of the neighborhood. The mortgage paid off, everything else carefully planned. Her husband had served in the military decades earlier, and after she lost him, she had learned to survive on almost nothing. She clipped coupons and repaired old appliances instead of replacing them. And somehow, there was always room at her table for one more. That morning, in the grocery store, she had calculated every dollar before buying the ingredients now warming 30 veterans. The money had been meant to last the week. Looking around the room, she felt no regret. When the last servings were gone, Gloria carried the empty pot to the sink and set it down gently. The metal echoed. For a moment, she rested both hands on the counter and let herself feel tired. The shelves behind her looked noticeably barer. Tomorrow would require creativity. But 30 people would sleep with full stomachs tonight, and her late husband had always said the same thing. Character reveals itself most clearly when nobody is watching. She just didn't know somebody was. The last of the veterans lingered after dinner, reluctant to step back into the cold. One by one they thanked her and left. The silver-haired man remained seated longer than the others, his empty bowl in front of him, his bread gone, lost in thought. Gloria approached and lifted his bowl. "Did you enjoy the soup?" He looked up and smiled. "It was the best meal I've had in a very long time." "I'm glad." His eyes settled on the bare pantry visible through the kitchen doorway. "You fed a lot of people tonight. Everyone deserves a hot meal on a night like this. Even when it costs you something?" She smiled. "Especially then." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stood, picked up his old backpack, and looked at her one final time. "Thank you, ma'am. More than you know." She wished him a safe night and watched him go. She never saw him stop beneath the awning outside. She never saw him take a phone from his pocket, a phone far better than his jacket suggested, and dial a number from memory. The call connected in 2 rings. He listened. Then he spoke, calm and measured. "I found her. A pause. Yes, it's her. It's the chief's wife. Another pause, longer this time, and his voice dropped lower, as if the rain itself might carry it. She's living on nothing. No one's been taking care of her. She gave away her last meal tonight and didn't blink. He glanced back through the window at Gloria, wiping down tables, alone. There's something else. She's still feeding our guys out of that center. And I think the people who are supposed to be feeding them have been stealing every dime. Inside, Gloria turned off a light and prepared to close for the night. She believed the story had ended with a meal. Outside, it was only beginning, and the man dialing the second number was no longer talking about soup. Gloria slept peacefully, unaware that her quiet act had already traveled far beyond the neighborhood she called home. Across the country, silence was not what existed. Messages were forwarded, old numbers dialed. Men who had served together decades ago waking each other in the dark, because the silver-haired veteran had said a name none of them had heard in years. A name they had buried with full honors. Brooks. She woke at 5, as always, made coffee, and stood by the window with her grocery notebook, listing what a too-thin budget could stretch to. She had no idea that, 3 states away, men were already in their trucks. At exactly 7:15, Gloria noticed the first unfamiliar vehicle. A dark SUV rolled slowly past her house. She paid little attention. Then a second appeared. A few minutes later, a third. She set down her coffee and stepped closer to the window. More came. Pickup trucks. SUVs. Ordinary cars. They parked respectfully along both sides of the road. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just a steady, organized arrival. 10 became 20. 20 became 50. Men and women emerged, many carrying the unmistakable posture of people who had spent years in uniform. Some in jackets with faded insignia, some in plain civilian clothes, all of them moving with a discipline impossible to miss. Every new arrival glanced toward her house. Not aggressively, not curiously, respectfully, as though they had come with a purpose. Hundreds now lined the street, and yet the neighborhood stayed eerily quiet. Conversations were low. Movements were orderly. It felt less like a gathering and more like a formation. Gloria stepped onto her porch into the cold. Neighbors stood on their own porches, faces mirroring her confusion. Then a black SUV stopped near the center of the street. The door opened. A tall man stepped out, his hair touched with gray, his posture shaped by decades of command. The moment he appeared, a subtle shift moved through the crowd. People straightened. Conversations faded. He looked directly toward her house, offered a small respectful nod, and began walking toward her porch. Behind him stood 300 men who did not look like they had come to say thank you. They looked like they had come for a reckoning. And Gloria still had no idea why. She did not have long to wonder. Before the tall man reached her steps, a different vehicle pushed through the line. A white sedan with a magnetic decal on the door, Sentinel Veterans Foundation. It parked badly, half on the curb, as though its driver had not expected the street to be full. A man in a pressed gray suit climbed out, clipboard in hand, a younger assistant trailing him. He took one look at the crowd, decided to ignore it, and walked straight up Gloria's front walk with the brisk confidence of a man who believed he held the only authority that mattered. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, loud enough for the porches to hear. "Trevor Lang, Sentinel Foundation. We oversee veteran services for this district." He flipped a page. "We've received complaints regarding unauthorized food distribution at the community center on 4th Street, operating without our partnership agreement, soliciting and redirecting donations meant for accredited programs." A murmur moved through the watching neighbors. Gloria blinked. "I cooked soup. I gave it to hungry men, using a facility under our service umbrella, without oversight," and he glanced at his clipboard. "There's a question of where supplementary donations have been going. These are serious matters. Funds for veterans are federally sensitive." He said it the way a man says a thing he has said many times before, to many frightened people, always with the same result. The neighbors who had admired Gloria for years now shifted uncomfortably. A woman 2 doors down lowered her eyes. Old questions surfaced. Why does she keep helping strangers when she can barely help herself? And for the first time, those questions had an official voice attached to them. Gloria stood very straight on her own porch, in front of the entire street, and felt heat rise into her face. In 60 seconds, a man with a clipboard had turned the kindest act of her year into a crime. What she did not yet understand was why a foundation that claimed to feed veterans would be so eager to stop her from feeding them, and why Trevor Lang's hands were shaking. That's enough. The voice came from behind Lang. Calm, unhurried. The voice of a man who had never once had to raise it. The tall, gray-haired man had reached the foot of the steps. He removed his gloves and extended a hand to Gloria first, to her, before anyone else, while 300 people watched. Good morning, ma'am. My name is Commander Daniel Hayes. Gloria shook his hand, still burning with the public accusation. Commander, I know, Hayes said gently. You don't understand why we're here. We'll fix that. Then he turned, and for the first time looked directly at Trevor Lang, and the temperature on the porch seemed to drop 10 degrees. You're from Sentinel. The district office, Lang said. And this is a regulatory matter, so if you drove 40 minutes, Hayes said, to serve a complaint at 7:15 in the morning on a 72-year-old widow, the same morning 300 of us happened to arrive. He let the sentence sit there. Who told you to come today, Mr. Lang? Lang opened his mouth, closed it. The clipboard trembled. Nobody, he said. It's routine. Nothing about this is routine. Hayes turned his back on him, which was its own kind of insult, and faced Gloria again. I believe you met someone last night. A quiet man, silver hair, sat near the back. Recognition crossed her face. Yes, he had soup with everyone else. The man you fed last night, Hayes said, choosing his words with care. I won't give you his name yet. He asked me not to, and he's earned the right to ask. But understand this, when he sat at your table, he was not a hungry stranger. He had been looking for something for a long time. And last night, he found it. Found what? Gloria asked. You. Hayes let it sit. Or, to be exact, whose you are. Gloria went very still. The street, the crowd, the clipboard, the cold, all of it seemed to recede. I don't understand, she said. Your late husband. Hayes's voice softened to something almost reverent, and yet there was a carefulness threaded under it, as though he were stepping around a hole in the floor. Master Chief Walter Brooks. To most of the country, that name means nothing. To the men standing behind me, it means almost everything. He paused. We lost track of his family years ago. We were told there was no one left to look after. Last night, we learned that wasn't true. We were told. Gloria caught the phrase and did not let it go. Told by whom? Told when? Told why? Behind Hayes, 300 men stood in the cold and waited, and Gloria realized, with a slow and dizzying certainty, that not one of them had come about a pot of soup. They had come because of a man who was already dead, and because someone, somewhere, had worked very hard to convince them that the chief's widow was already gone. The question opened beneath her like a trapdoor. Who told 300 of Walter's men that the chief had no one left to protect? And what did they gain by my disappearing? Hayes guided her gently to the porch railing, where she could see the full length of the street. He spoke quietly, only for her. Half of these men are alive because of your husband. The other half were trained by men he trained. He nodded toward the silent ranks. When the man you fed called us last night and said he'd found the chief's widow living on canned beans and still giving her last meal away to homeless vets, there wasn't a soul on that call who went back to sleep. We thought we'd buried the last of the chief's story with the chief. We were wrong, and some of us are starting to wonder how we ever came to believe it in the first place. Gloria's hands tightened on the railing. Walter never let me meet any of you. He kept that part of his life separate. He said it was safer that way. Something flickered across Hayes's face at the word safer. Fast, and then gone. A man closing a door before she could see what was behind it. He chose not to chase it. Not yet. We came to honor you, he said. We came to make sure you never count pennies in a grocery store again. And we came, he added, lower, because the man you fed saw something at that center last night that none of us can stop thinking about. Then Hayes stepped back, turned to face the 300, and raised his right hand. It began at the front and rolled down the street like a wave. 300 hands rose in unison. Veterans, operators, old men who had carried the chief's wounded out of places that did not have names. They stood at attention before a 72-year-old woman in a cardigan on a frost-covered porch, and they held the salute. Tears filled the eyes of the neighbors who had, 10 minutes earlier, looked away. Trucks rolled forward. Volunteers unloaded boxes onto her lawn. Canned goods, rice, pasta, fresh vegetables, coffee, bread, enough to fill her pantry many times over. Local businesses called out pledges. Someone announced a fund for the community center's meals. Gloria covered her mouth. The empty pot from the night before had somehow become the beginning of something larger than she could comprehend. It looked, for one golden moment, like the whole story. A good woman's quiet kindness, finally seen and repaid. The end. Then Commander Hayes leaned close, so that only she could hear, and said the sentence that would not let any of them go home. Mrs. Brooks, before we celebrate, I need to ask you something. He glanced at the white sedan, where Trevor Lang now sat hunched over a phone, dialing fast. Why is a foundation that's supposed to feed these men so afraid of one old woman with a soup pot? And just like that, the story that had ended began again. They moved the conversation inside, away from the crowd, to the small kitchen at the community center where it had all started. The empty pot still sat on the stove, washed and dry. Hayes brought the silver-haired veteran and a young man named Danny, a homeless vet Gloria had fed dozens of times, who now stood twisting his cap in his hands as though he might be in trouble. The silver-haired man set down his backpack and finally offered his hand. I should have given you my name last night, ma'am. Eli Mercer, Senior Chief, retired. I served under your husband for 11 years. He pulled me off a beach once that I had no business walking off of. His voice did not waver, but something in it did. When I heard the chief's widow was alive and feeding our men out of an empty pantry, I didn't believe it. They told all of us, years back, that there was no family left. I came here last night to prove the rumor wrong. He glanced at the pot. Instead, I proved it true. And then I started wondering who'd lied to us, and why. Tell her, Eli said to Danny, gently. Tell her what you told me. Danny looked at the floor. Sentinel's supposed to pay our housing vouchers. Mine got approved 8 months ago. Money's allocated. I've seen the letter, but it never reaches the landlords. Every time I call, they say it's processing. Every time I show up, that man Lang says there's a backlog. He swallowed. There ain't no backlog, ma'am. There's just no money. So I sleep where I can. And I come here because you're the only one who actually feeds me. Gloria looked at the young man, and then at Eli, and then at the empty pot. How many of you? She asked. All of us, Danny said. All 30, last night. Sentinel's the only program in this district, and not one of us has ever gotten what we were promised. Hayes set a folder on the counter. Eli noticed it last night. 30 men who all qualify for Sentinel housing. All of them homeless. All of them eating at your table instead. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. So we made some calls. He opened the folder. Sentinel doesn't just run this district, Hayes said. It runs 19. Across 4 states. It collects donations under your husband's old unit's name. They license it. They say it honors the legacy. Tens of millions a year. And in every single district, the men who are supposed to receive that money are sleeping in cars and eating at community kitchens run by people like you. Gloria felt the kitchen tilt. 19 districts. 19 that we've found, Hayes said. In one night. Eli set his coffee down. He had been silent through most of it, but now he spoke, and the room turned to him the way rooms do when the quietest man finally decides to talk. There's a thing about Sentinel nobody outside the teams would notice, he said. They don't just use a unit name. They use his unit. Walters. They licensed it years ago, paid a fee, got a blessing on paper, and ever since, every dollar they raise comes in under the legacy of the men he led. He looked at Gloria. When I sat at that table last night and you handed me soup, I wasn't thinking about Sentinel. I was thinking the chief's wife is feeding the chief's men out of her own pocket, while a foundation gets rich off his name doing the exact opposite. That's why I called. Not the soup, ma'am. The math. Danny shifted. There's another thing, he said, and his voice had gone careful, the way a man's voice goes when he is deciding whether saying something will make it worse. Last spring, there was a lady 3 streets over. Miss Adele. She ran a meal night out of her garage. Sentinel sent a man with a clipboard, same as today. Permits, complaints, donations going the wrong way. 2 weeks later her garage got red tagged, and she stopped. He swallowed. Nobody salutes Miss Adele. Nobody came for her. The kitchen went very still. If Sentinel had a routine, a clipboard, a complaint, a red tag, perfected over years, then this morning had not been the first time they tried to shut down a kitchen. It was only the first time 300 men had been standing on the lawn when they did. which meant a man with a clipboard had not driven 40 minutes to scold one old woman about soup. He had driven 40 minutes to put out a fire. And the question nobody wanted to say out loud hung in the room like smoke. How many other Glorias had Sentinel already shut down, quietly, before anyone arrived to salute them? It moved fast after that, the way a thing moves when it has been waiting years to be pushed. Hayes knew people. The 300 outside knew more. Within 2 days, a retired JAG attorney named Owen Bishop had set up at Gloria's kitchen table with a laptop and a legal pad, working for nothing. A local reporter named Dana Reyes had run the first story. Decorated Seal's widow feeds veterans the foundation forgot, and it had jumped from her small paper to the national wire by the second morning. Danny was no longer the only one talking. Veterans from the other districts began calling Bishop's number. The same story, over and over, in different cities. Approved vouchers that never arrived. Relief grants that processed forever. A foundation that photographed beautifully and paid nothing. Then the evidence escalated in a way no one expected. A woman named Helen Park flew in from the Sentinel Regional Office without telling anyone she was coming. She had spent 6 years as their forensic accountant. She set a thumb drive on the table in front of Bishop and Gloria and said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Nobody ever did. Everybody just wanted the gala photos. On the drive were ledgers. Real ones, the kind kept beside the ones shown to donors. Money came in under the unit's licensed name, was routed through 3 shell vendors with names like Steadfast Logistics and Honor Provisions, and came out the other side as consulting fees and leadership stipends. The veterans' line items existed only on paper. Tens of millions, Bishop murmured, scrolling. She's right. The programs are real on the website and fictional on the books. Then we have them, Gloria said. Bishop didn't answer right away. He was looking at one recurring name in the consulting column. A name he clearly recognized. A name he did not want to read out loud in front of the chief's widow. He closed the laptop. "Mr. Bishop," Gloria said. "Who? Let me be sure first," he said quietly. "Some doors you only get to open once." But Gloria had spent 50 years reading the faces of men who were protecting her from something. She knew the look. Whatever was on that drive, it did not just belong to Sentinel. It belonged to someone Walter had known. Bishop took the thumb drive to the federal prosecutor's office on a Thursday, with Hayes beside him and Helen Park's signed statement in hand. By Friday afternoon, the news had it. A probe was opening into the Sentinel Veterans Foundation. Trevor Lang was placed on administrative leave. 3 of the shell vendors were named. The community center threw an impromptu celebration. Danny got the keys to an apartment that very week. A landlord, shamed by the headlines, simply waived the back rent and let him in. The 300 had mostly gone home, but they sent things. Quilts. A new commercial stove for the center. A handwritten card from a man who had served with Walter in a place he could not name, thanking Gloria for finishing what the chief started, a line she did not understand and tucked into her notebook to ask about later. For 9 days, it felt finished. It felt like justice. Then, on the 10th day, it came undone. The federal probe was quietly narrowed. The shell vendors, it turned out, were registered to a holding company whose paperwork was clean enough to require subpoenas that would take a year. Trevor Lang's leave became a voluntary resignation with no findings of wrongdoing. A statement from the foundation's board expressed full cooperation and confidence that this isolated regional mismanagement does not reflect the institution's 8 decades of service to those who served. And then Helen Park stopped answering her phone. Bishop drove to her hotel. She had checked out. No forwarding address. A note slid under his door at the center 2 days later, in a careful hand, said only, "They offered me a number I couldn't say no to and reminded me I have a daughter. I'm sorry. The truth is real. I just can't be the one to say it." Her thumb drive, entered into evidence, was now sealed under a protective order obtained by the foundation's attorneys, citing donor privacy. The pressure did not stop with Helen Park. Dana Reyes called Gloria, shaken, to say her editor had received a letter from a firm whose name took up 2 lines of letterhead, and that the wire pickup of her follow-up story had fallen through without explanation. And on the 9th night, Gloria's own phone rang. A man's voice she did not recognize, polite, almost gentle, said only that an old woman had already received more kindness than most people see in a lifetime, that pushing further would be ungrateful, and that it would be a shame if the community center's funding and her late husband's good name were dragged through something unpleasant. Then the line went dead. She wrote down the time of the call in her grocery notebook because she did not know what else to do with her hands. In the span of a week, Sentinel had gone from cornered to untouched. Gloria sat at the kitchen table that night, the celebration's leftover streamers still taped to the wall, and understood for the first time that she was not fighting a man with a clipboard. She was fighting whoever had the power to make a federal case shrink overnight, scare off a witness, and seal the proof, all without leaving a fingerprint. And that person had not yet shown his face. He showed it 3 days later, at her front door, smiling. He arrived in a quiet town car, alone, no clipboard, no assistant. An older man, beautifully dressed, with the kind of upright bearing that made strangers stand a little straighter without knowing why. White hair, clear eyes, a face the country half recognized from talk shows and ribbon cuttings, and the occasional cable news segment about putting service before self. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, removing his hat. "I hope you'll forgive an old man for coming unannounced. My name is Gideon Marsh." Gloria knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Captain Gideon Marsh, retired Navy, chairman of the Sentinel Foundation, recipient of a wall of awards, a fixture at every memorial and gala for 30 years. The public face of honoring veterans. "I'll be brief, and then I'll get out of your way," Marsh said warmly. "I came to apologize. What Trevor Lang did in this district was a disgrace, and the board should have caught it years ago. We failed these men. We failed you." He pressed a hand to his chest. "And I came because of something more personal." His voice gentled. "I served with your husband, Walter, and I went back a very long way. He was the finest man I ever knew." Gloria's breath caught. In 9 years, she had met no one who had served with Walter at his level. He had kept that world sealed off. And now here was the man at the very top of it, on her porch, calling him Walter. "He never spoke of his commanders," she said carefully. "He wouldn't have. That was the chief." Marsh's eyes glistened. "I'd like to help you, Gloria. Properly. The foundation will fund the center directly. Your name on it. Your rules. No Sentinel oversight. And I'd like to establish a scholarship in Walter's name. It's the least I owe him." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, thick and cream-colored. A small start. For the center. No conditions. It was everything she needed. Money for the men. Honor for Walter. The fight. Ended by the kindest possible hand. Gloria looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the man. And a cold thread of memory pulled tight in her chest. Bishop closing the laptop, refusing to read a name. The handwritten card thanking her for finishing what the chief started. Walter, years ago, standing at this same door before a trip he wouldn't explain, telling her that if anyone ever came offering money in his name, she should count the men in the room before she counted the money. She did not take the envelope. "Captain Marsh," she said slowly, "how did you know my husband called himself the chief, when his rank was Master Chief? And the only people who ever called him just the chief were the men who served under him." For the first time, the warmth in Gideon Marsh's eyes went somewhere else. And Gloria understood that the most dangerous man in the entire story had just shaken her hand. He recovered in half a second. A lifetime of practice had made him good at it. The smile returned. Old habit. We all called him that, up and down the chain. He set the envelope on the porch rail, since she would not take it. Think about the center, at least. The men shouldn't suffer for pride. Then he tipped his hat and was gone before she could answer. But he had made a mistake, and they both knew it. Gloria carried the envelope inside without opening it and called Bishop. "The name on the ledger you wouldn't read me," she said. "It was Marsh, wasn't it?" A long silence. "Gideon Marsh is the most decorated non-profit figure in the country," Bishop said finally. "2 senators on speed dial, a foundation older than I am. The consulting fees route through a firm 3 holding companies removed from his name. It's there, I know it's there. But proving it means proving he controlled those shells, and that's the layer they spent 30 years burying." He exhaled. "He came to your house, Gloria. He doesn't do that. Which means you scare him. The question is why?" Gloria looked at the cream-colored envelope on her kitchen table. "Because of Walter," she said. "Marsh didn't come to honor my husband. He came to find out what my husband left behind." That night, for the first time in 9 years, Gloria climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Up against the far wall, beneath a sheet, sat Walter's footlocker. She had never opened it. After the funeral, she had carried it up here and left it, because some grief is best left sealed. She knelt in the dust and lifted the lid. On top lay his folded uniform. Beneath it, his medals. And beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, a thick stack of papers and a small cassette recorder, with a note in Walter's careful hand taped to the lid. It read, "Gloria, if anyone ever comes asking, the answer was never the soup. It was always the money. Count the men. W." Her husband had known. 9 years ago, Walter Brooks had known exactly who Gideon Marsh was, and he had hidden the proof in the one place no one would think to look for it. In the house of the wife, everyone had forgotten. She did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table until dawn with Walter's papers spread before her, and slowly the shape of it emerged. In his last years of service, Walter had become something stranger than an operator, a trusted name the team sent to vet the charities raising money in the unit's honor, because no one would lie to the chief. Marsh had been building Sentinel even then, and somewhere in those years Walter had been asked to bless it. Instead, he had counted the men. He had visited the districts and found exactly what Eli and Danny found 3 decades later. The money came in, the veterans got nothing, and the difference flowed through 3 careful layers back to Gideon Marsh. He had compiled all of it. Routing slips, internal memos with Marsh's initials, and the cassette, a recorded conversation in which Marsh, believing he spoke to a friend, explained why the men would never see the money, and why the chief of all people should understand that the cause is bigger than any one beggar in a parking lot. Walter had taken it up the chain, and the chain, full of Marsh's friends, had buried it. They could not discredit the chief. No one could, so they had simply contained him, reassigned, retired quietly, with full honors and a warning dressed up as a thank you, to keep the family safe. That was the safer Hayes had flinched at. That was why Walter had sealed his world away from her. He had spent his last years protecting her from a truth he could not bury and could not win. And he had left it for her, just in case the day ever came when someone finally arrived to listen. 300 men had arrived. Gloria wrapped the papers back in the oilcloth, picked up the cassette, and called Owen Bishop at 6 in the morning. She did not, that night, reach the bottom of the footlocker. There were more folders beneath the Sentinel papers, thick ones, tied with the same careful string, labeled in Walter's hand with names she did not recognize. But she had already found enough to make her hands shake, and grief and exhaustion told her the same thing they always had. Some things are best left until you are strong enough. She lowered the lid most of the way and went downstairs to the phone. "Mr. Bishop," she said. "Walter didn't take it to his grave. He took it to his attic. And there's a tape." It nearly didn't matter. That was the part Gloria would remember most. How close it came to not matching at all. Because Gideon Marsh did not wait. The morning after his visit, before Bishop had even finished copying Walter's files, the Foundation's lawyers filed an emergency motion. They alleged that Gloria Brooks was operating an unlicensed charity, soliciting donations under a protected name, Walter's unit, and they produced the cream-colored envelopes matching paperwork to suggest she had accepted Foundation funds, and then disparaged the very institution that helped her. Dana Reyes's editor received a letter threatening ruinous litigation. The center's new direct funding pledge evaporated. A code enforcement notice, real this time, signed, official, appeared taped to the community center's door, condemning the building for occupancy and fire safety violations, pending an inspection that was scheduled, conveniently, for 6 months out. The men could not be fed there. Gloria could not legally cook there. And the woman who had given away her last meal was now, on paper, a fraud who had taken a generous old captain's charity and spat on it. The neighborhood, which had saluted her, grew quiet again, quieter than before. Hayes came to the kitchen and set both hands flat on the table, and for the first time the commander looked tired. "He's going to run out the clock," he said. "Seal the tape under privacy. Tie up the ledger in subpoenas. Smear you in the meantime. In a year, the story's dead, the center's demolished, you're broke." And he gives a speech about resilience at the next gala. He looked at her. He's done it before. This is the part where everyone goes home. Gloria looked around the kitchen, at the streamers still taped to the wall from a celebration that turned out to be false, at the empty pot on the stove, at the grocery notebook, where she had once agonized over the price of bread, while a man in a town car moved millions with a phone call. It was the darkest the whole thing had been. darker than the night she scraped the bottom of the pot, because that night she had at least known she was doing right. Now she had been made to look like exactly what Marsh had spent 30 years pretending not to be. "Mr. Bishop," she said quietly. "The tape. Can a smear bury a man's own voice?" Bishop did not answer right away. When he did, he chose his words the way a man chooses footing on ice. "That depends," he said, "on whether anyone will believe it's his voice. It is his voice. I know that. You know that." He rubbed his eyes. "But it's a 30-year-old cassette, and the only living witness to that conversation is the man on the other end of it. Marsh has 2 senators, a wall of medals, and the finest reputation money can rent. So the first thing his people will do is the oldest thing in the book, except that in this decade it actually works." He let it land. "They'll say it's fake. A forgery. A grieving widow, manipulated by activists, splicing a hero's words together. And half the country will want to believe them, because the other half of the story is uglier than they can stand." The kitchen went very still. Hayes said it for all of them. "He doesn't bury the tape. He turns it into proof that you're the liar. And he turns the chief into one too." So the tape, by itself, was not a weapon. It was a loaded gun that could be made to fire backward. Gloria felt the floor of the whole thing shift beneath her, because if releasing Walter's voice only convinced the country that his widow had defiled his memory to chase attention, then Marsh did not merely survive. He won cleaner than he ever had before. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she reached into her cardigan and laid Walter's note flat on the table. The answer was never the soup. It was always the money. "Count the men. I kept asking myself," she said slowly, "why a careful man would leave me a tape and a stack of paper. Why both? Why he didn't just trust the recording." She looked up. "Mr. Bishop, on that tape, does Marsh say numbers? Amounts? The names of the vendors?" Bishop went rigid. He understood before she finished. His hands were already moving to the folder of routing slips from Walter's locker. "He does," he said quietly. "He says the percentages. He says Steadfast by name. He says figures that were never public, figures that match these slips line for line. And they match the sealed ledger Helen Park gave us before they frightened her off." He looked up, and something fierce came into his tired face. If they call the tape a forgery, they have to explain how a forger knew the exact secret arithmetic inside their own books. They can't. The tape proves the paper. The paper proves the tape. Apart, each one is deniable. He exhaled. Together, they leave Marsh exactly one move. "To call my husband a liar," Gloria said. "Yes." She folded the note and put it back over her heart. Then let him try it in front of the numbers. They did not take it to the prosecutor, who could be slowed. They did not take it to the board, which belonged to Marsh. They took it to everyone, at once. The note, the cassette, the transcript, and the routing slips laid down beside it, so that anyone in the country could match the amounts with a fingertip. Marsh moved within hours, exactly as Bishop had predicted, and for one long day it looked as though he would win anyway. The Foundation released a statement of profound sadness that the family of a beloved Master Chief had been exploited by outside agitators to fabricate a recording. A forensic audio firm Marsh's people had retained announced that the cassette was consistent with the characteristics of synthetic manipulation. A senator went on the morning programs to defend one of the great Americans of our age against a cruel smear built on a dead man's memory, and to wonder aloud, gently, whether an elderly woman in distress had been used. And somewhere out of sight, a quiet call reached Helen Park's hotel a second time. Her lawyer phoned Bishop to say she had gone white and stopped answering her door. For one day, the oldest move in the book worked. The comment sections turned on Gloria. 2 local businesses that had pledged to the center withdrew, pending clarity. Even Dana's own editor asked her, carefully, whether she was certain. The neighborhood held its breath, and Hayes did not say this is the part where everyone goes home. But Gloria watched him think it, and watched him hate that he was thinking it. Then the numbers did what no amount of courage could be intimidated out of doing. A reporter Dana trusted laid the transcript beside the routing slips on live television and read them aloud together. The amounts Marsh spoke on the tape, the amounts on the paper Walter had hidden in an attic for 9 years, the percentages, the vendor called Steadfast, and asked the only question that mattered. How does a forgery know the secret arithmetic inside a foundation's own sealed books? And when people went back and read the audio firm's statement closely, they noticed it never actually said the tape was fake. It said the tape could be fake, which was a different thing entirely, and the difference was suddenly visible to everyone who could count. And Helen Park, in her hotel room, watched a man on a screen call the chief a liar to protect the people who had threatened her daughter, and found the last of her courage in the worst possible thing they could have done. That afternoon, she walked into a field office with the originals, the real ledgers, kept in the Foundation's own format, that matched the cassette word for word. This time she did not check out of the hotel. This time she stayed and let them assign someone to her door. The forgery claim did not survive contact with its own evidence. You cannot fake a recording that knows numbers no forger ever saw. Marsh's own countermove had forced the country to set the tape and the paper side by side, and side by side, they destroyed him. The first senator stopped returning his calls by nightfall. The second issued a careful statement about deeply troubling new information. The federal probe that had been quietly narrowed reopened within the week, not because the prosecutors had found fresh courage, but because the protective order Marsh had bought now looked, on every screen in the country, like a man burying his own arithmetic. Trevor Lang understood power better than anyone in the story, which was precisely why he was the first to abandon it. He did not crumble in a single meek sentence. He arrived at Bishop's office unannounced, set a banker's box on the desk, and laid out 30 years of where everything was filed, because Lang had always known he was the kind of man a chairman keeps close until the day a chairman needs someone to blame. "I kept a copy of every order Marsh ever gave me," he said, evenly. "For exactly this morning." He was not confessing. He was negotiating. And the discovery that Sentinel's most loyal fixer had spent years quietly arranging to outlive its collapse told Gloria more about how dangerous the thing had truly been than any salute on her street ever could. The 80-year-old institution did not fall all at once. It came apart the way these things actually do, in resignations dressed up as retirements, in frozen accounts, in a board that suddenly could not remember approving anything, in 19 district offices going dark one after another. The shell companies that would have taken a year to subpoena unraveled in a month, once the men who ran them began racing one another to cooperate before Lang's box made them worthless. Sentinel was placed into receivership, and what remained of its money was ordered redirected to the veterans it had always been meant for. And Gideon Marsh was indicted. It was not a fairy tale. Gloria made sure to remember that, because the men around her wanted to call it one, and it wasn't. Marsh was indicted, but he was old and rich and represented by people who were very good at delay. He would likely never see the inside of a cell. The realistic outcome, Bishop told her honestly, was a settlement, a forfeiture, a fall from grace that ended in a quiet house and not a prison. Two of the senators who had taken his calls issued statements regretting their limited awareness and were reelected. Some of the money was simply gone, spent decades ago, unrecoverable. The code enforcement notice on the community center was withdrawn, but the center needed real repairs the lawsuit had drained the funds to make. Gloria's name was cleared, fully, publicly, but no one returned the 9 days she had walked the neighborhood as a suspected fraud, and some neighbors never quite met her eyes the same way again, ashamed of how quickly they had looked away. She did not get rich. She turned down a large offer for the rights to her story without ceremony, because Walter had taught her what money in his name was worth. The scholarship Marsh had dangled was established after all, not by Marsh, but by the 300, in Walter's name, funded by men finally allowed to repay a debt they had carried for 30 years. What she got was smaller and truer. She got Walter's name cleared too, not just hers. The official record, so long ago, had labeled the chief's last years as a quiet decline, a good man reassigned and retired. Now it read differently. Now it said he had been right, and had been silenced for being right, and had protected his men and his wife the only way left to him. They held a ceremony for that. Gloria stood where she had stood on her porch, and the men saluted, and this time she understood every reason why. And she got the center back. Months later, the kitchen on 4th Street smelled of chicken and herbs again. Gloria stood at the new commercial stove the 300 had sent, and lifted the lid on a large metal pot. Steam rose. Outside, it was not the coldest night of the year, just an ordinary one, and the room behind her was full. Danny was there, no longer sleeping in his car, helping her serve, learning her recipe so the center would have it after her. Eli Mercer came most nights now, silver hair and tired eyes, sitting at the same back table, watching her the way he had the first night, except now she knew exactly why. The pantry behind her was full. The mortgage on hope, as she thought of it, was paid. She filled the bowls one at a time, the way she always had, and she did not think about Gideon Marsh or the senators or the 80-year-old institution that had come apart because a quiet man counted the men instead of the money. She thought about the people in front of her, who were warm and fed and seen. When the room had emptied and the last bowl was washed, she carried the pot to the sink and rested her hands on the counter, just as she had that first night. On the windowsill sat a small framed photograph she had brought from the attic. Walter, young, in a uniform she had never been allowed to ask about. Beside it lay her grocery notebook, and tucked into its cover, his note. Count the men. She had counted them, all of them, and it had been enough. But as she switched off the light and reached for her coat, Gloria paused. Because Eli Mercer had said something the week before, quietly, the way he said everything, while drying a bowl. He had said that Walter's attic had held the proof for this foundation, for Sentinel, for Marsh. And then he had added, almost to himself, that the chief had vetted 11 charities in those last years and only ever talked about one of them. Only ever talked about one. Gloria stood in the dark kitchen, her hand on the light switch, and felt the cold thread pull tight in her chest one more time. 11 charities. 1 footlocker. She had opened the lid and found the papers on top, and stopped reading once she understood Sentinel, because some grief is best left sealed, and she had finally gotten her husband's name back, and the men were warm, and she was tired. She had never reached the bottom of the locker. Gloria looked through the window at the flag moving gently against the dark, and then up, toward the ceiling, toward the narrow stairs, toward the attic where a dead man's footlocker still sat beneath a sheet, 3/4 full of papers she had never read, in the careful hand of a husband who had spent his last years learning exactly how many places a quiet thief could hide. Count the men, he had written. She had assumed he meant the 30. She was no longer sure. Gloria turned off the light. And somewhere, in a quiet house she would visit again sooner than she thought, the rest of what Walter Brooks knew was still waiting to be counted.